#ChatGPT. When I woke up in the middle of the night and felt someone slip under the covers beside me, my first instinct wasn't fear. It was relief. Relief that, finally, after so many silent nights, he had chosen to come close. The warmth of his body, the slow inhale of air, the familiar scent of his cologne, it had to be him. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just let my breath slow, let my body soften. For a moment, I felt like a woman again, not just a wife, not a caretaker of his late wife's memory, not a shadow in his home. Just a woman being held. I thought about all the nights I had turned away tears, all the times I had longed for this nearness. And now, here he was. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. I wanted to believe it was him. Because if it wasn't, if I asked and found out otherwise, something in me would break. So I let it happen. I let the silence speak for us both. I let myself be touched, held, comforted in the way I had longed for since the day I moved into his home. It wasn't until morning, when I saw him walk into the room freshly dressed and holding my tea like he always did, that the truth began to crack through the edges of my mind. That same cologne lingered in the air, but now it came from two different directions. And suddenly, I couldn't breathe. I wish I could tell you I reacted the way I should have. That I screamed, that I accused, that I demanded answers. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled. I took the tea. And I began to doubt everything I thought I knew. Let me tell you how it all began. But before I share the secret I've hidden for so long, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And have you ever held on to a truth so tightly, only to have it slip through your fingers in the end? I didn't expect to feel like a guest in my own marriage. But that's exactly what I became, a well-mannered outsider in a house frozen in time. It wasn't a home, not really. More like a museum curated by memory. Photographs of her were everywhere, in the hallway, in the study, above the fireplace. Her presence lingered in the arrangement of the furniture, in the floral scent of the linens, in the untouched books on the shelf with her bookmarks still nestled inside. No one said her name aloud, but she lived in the silence, in the pauses, in the spaces I wasn't allowed to touch. He didn't ask me to change anything, but he didn't invite me to either. My husband, calm, reserved, polite to the point of discomfort, made me tea every morning and asked about the weather, never my thoughts. I tried to match his rhythm. I cooked, I cleaned, I folded his shirts the way I assumed she once had. I wore dresses with modest patterns and kept my voice gentle. I didn't want to be an intruder. But that's exactly how I felt. As though I had walked into a life that already belonged to someone else, and I was merely borrowing it. He slept in the guest room. He didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. At first, I thought it was temporary. Maybe he needed time. Maybe he was grieving in a way I couldn't understand. But as weeks passed, the pattern hardened. Dinner. Tea. A word or two. Then he would quietly excuse himself and close the door behind him. That door became a wall. I lay alone each night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of a house that wasn't mine. And then there was him, the son. My stepson. He was polite, always. But distant. Civil without warmth. Older than most sons still living at home, but not unusual in this town. He worked remotely, kept odd hours. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, his answers were brief. I couldn't read him. I tried, once or twice, to ask about his interests. He shrugged. I asked about his mother. He looked away. I asked about his father. He changed the subject. After a while, I stopped trying. But I noticed things. The way he lingered in doorways. The way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't leering. It wasn't inappropriate. It was curious. Studied. Like he was trying to figure me out. Like he was trying to understand what I was doing here, in this house, in his father's life. There was one evening, quiet, like the others, when I passed him in the hallway. His shoulder brushed mine. A simple thing. Accidental, maybe. But I felt it. Not the contact, but the pause that followed. He turned slightly, as if to say something, but didn't. His eyes flicked down and back up, and then he walked away. I stood there, staring at the empty space he left behind, feeling a strange flush creep up my neck. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself I was imagining things. That I was reading too much into silence and glances and the absence of affection in my own marriage. But it stayed with me. That pause. That look. The tension that hung in the air like something unsaid. Days passed. Then weeks. My husband remained consistent, kind, quiet, detached. I told myself this was enough. That companionship, stability, and shared routine were love. That intimacy wasn't necessary, that I was too old to need it, that those longings belonged to a younger version of me. But I was lying to myself. Every time I saw a couple holding hands in the park, every time I heard laughter through a neighbor's open window, I felt the ache of something missing. And yet, I endured. Because what else was there to do? I had made my choice. I had married a good man. I had a roof over my head, food on the table, safety. I had no right to complain. That's what I told myself. Until that night. The night I woke to the sensation of a warm body sliding into bed beside me. No words. No warning. Just the familiar scent of his cologne, the weight of his arm as it settled lightly across my waist. My breath caught. My heart thudded in my chest. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. But it was real. He had come to me, finally. After all the waiting, after all the wondering. I didn't turn to face him. I was afraid that if I moved, it would all vanish. That if I spoke, he would slip away again. So I stayed still. I let the warmth wrap around me. I closed my eyes and let the tears fall silently onto the pillow. Not from sorrow, but from the sheer relief of being touched. I whispered thank you in my head. Over and over. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for remembering I exist. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. We drifted into sleep like that, or at least, I did. And when I woke in the soft light of morning, the bed beside me was empty. But I didn't think much of it. He was an early riser. Maybe he had gone to make tea. So when he walked into the room, fully dressed, with my usual mug of Earl Grey and a casual good morning, I smiled back. But then I noticed something. He looked too rested. Too clean. His shirt wasn't wrinkled. His eyes weren't heavy. And then I realized, he smelled the same. The exact same. And something inside me shifted. I wanted to ask him if he had come to me in the night. I wanted to laugh nervously and brush it off if he said yes. I wanted to believe. But I couldn't ask. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. I spent the rest of that morning pretending. Pretending everything was normal, that the night before hadn't happened, that I wasn't slowly unraveling inside. I moved through the kitchen in slow, deliberate motions, wiping down the counter, pouring more tea, nodding as my husband recited the day's weather like a routine script. I watched his lips form words I couldn't hear, my ears ringing with questions I couldn't ask. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the sugar bowl. I told myself it was nothing. That I had dreamt it. That maybe I had mistaken a feeling for something more. But then I saw him, the son. Standing just beyond the threshold of the kitchen, arms folded across his chest, his gaze fixed on me. He wasn't trying to hide it. In fact, the stillness of his body, the calmness of his face, made it feel deliberate. Controlled. My chest tightened. His eyes didn't waver when I looked up. For a fraction of a second, everything stilled. No words passed between us. Only that long, unbearable pause. I turned away, hiding my face behind the teapot. I could feel the heat rushing up my neck, a flush of something I couldn't name. Shame, maybe. Or confusion. Or worse, recognition. My husband said something about needing to check emails and disappeared into his study, and just like that, I was alone again in the room with someone who wasn't supposed to know the things I was starting to realize. Later, I returned to the bedroom to make the bed. It looked the same as always, neatly made, pillows aligned. But the sheets carried a different story, one that refused to be folded back into order. As I pulled the blanket up, something shifted under the pillow. A faint scent wafted up, the cologne. I paused, pressing the fabric to my nose. It was familiar, yes, but it didn't belong there. That specific fragrance was always used sparingly, reserved for Sunday dinners or visits from old friends. My husband hadn't worn it in weeks. Yet the smell was fresh, recent, and very present. My hands moved without thinking, straightening, tucking, adjusting, all while my mind spiraled. I tried to anchor myself with logic. It could have clung to the sheets from an old use. Or the bottle may have leaked. But deep down, I didn't believe any of that. In the evening, we sat down for dinner. I made roasted chicken, something simple. He complimented it, like always. I smiled, like always. The son came late to the table, his hair slightly damp, a thin towel tossed over his shoulder. "Sorry," he said casually, taking his seat. "Shower ran long." I nodded, pretending not to notice the scent that followed him. The same scent. That scent. He reached for the bread basket, and as he passed it to me, our fingers brushed. Just a second, no more, but it lingered. I pulled back too quickly, causing the edge of the basket to clatter against my plate. My husband looked up, surprised. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," I answered too fast. "Just slipped." After dinner, I took refuge in the laundry room. I told myself I needed to put a load in, but really, I just needed space. Silence. Time to breathe. I leaned against the dryer, eyes closed, hands gripping the edge until my knuckles whitened. I needed to understand. I needed clarity. But I was too afraid to ask the questions that would give it to me. That night, I lay in bed longer than usual before turning off the lamp. My husband came in to say goodnight, kissed me on the forehead like a routine habit, and left for the guest room. I listened as the door clicked shut. Listened to his steps fade down the hall. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. I turned on my side, facing the window, the dim glow from the street lamp painting soft shapes on the curtains. Sleep didn't come. Not right away. I listened for footsteps. Waited. Dreaded. Hoped. And then, somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up again. The bed shifted. The mattress dipped slightly behind me. I didn't move. My heart raced. I told myself it was a dream, that I was reliving a memory. But the weight, the warmth, they were real. We kissed. That's all I'll say. Because everything else, everything after, is buried under too many questions I still don't know how to answer. In the morning, I woke to find the bed empty again. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and golden, like nothing had happened. I sat up slowly, my body aching in unfamiliar places, and reached for my robe. On the nightstand was my usual cup of tea, steaming gently. The same kind, the same mug. I picked it up, hesitated, then set it down without taking a sip. The mirror across the room caught my reflection, disheveled, pale, eyes slightly swollen from sleep. Or from something else. I didn't look like myself. I looked like someone caught in the middle of a story they didn't write. Downstairs, breakfast passed in silence. My husband skimmed the newspaper. The son scrolled through his phone. I watched them both, searching for something. A sign. A crack. Anything. But they remained unreadable. The son stood to leave first. As he walked past, he paused, just slightly, and whispered, barely audible, "Sleep well?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My husband looked up briefly, then returned to his newspaper. As if nothing was out of place. But everything was. I avoided mirrors that day. I moved through the house as if I were made of glass, afraid any glance, any reflection, would shatter the fragile barrier I had erected between what I had allowed and what I couldn't yet name. My body still felt the echoes of the night before, not just physically, but emotionally, in ways I couldn't fully admit. There was a kind of heaviness to my breath, to my limbs, like everything about me had become denser. As if guilt had settled into my bones. My husband asked if I wanted to take a walk. It was a beautiful morning, he said, and we hadn't walked together in some time. I smiled, nodded, said yes. We strolled through the neighborhood, along streets lined with neat gardens and trimmed hedges. I forced conversation, about the changing leaves, about the neighbor's dog, about nothing. He seemed pleased. Pleased that I was smiling. Pleased that we were, from the outside, a married couple taking in the day. I watched him as he talked, his profile in the sunlight, the way his fingers lightly brushed mine as we walked. I searched for something, a trace of knowing, a flicker of suspicion. But there was nothing. Just his usual, quiet presence. Back home, I folded laundry in the guest room, our room, his room. A space that still held her scent. The windows were open, letting in a crisp breeze, but I felt suffocated. I turned to close the closet and saw it, the bottle of cologne on the dresser, tilted ever so slightly. The cap was off. That alone wouldn't have meant much, except I knew my husband never left it that way. He was meticulous. Methodical. Every item in its place. The scent hung in the air like a memory. Like a clue. Like a confession. I stepped closer. Picked it up. The bottle was lighter than usual. Not by much, but enough. I set it back down, turning the cap until it clicked, and left the room with my heart pounding so loud I was sure someone would hear. In the kitchen, I tried to ground myself. I poured water into a kettle, cut lemons, rinsed herbs. The mundanity of the tasks offered brief solace. But even there, the silence wrapped around me. It was in the way the floor creaked, in the way the refrigerator hummed. Everything had changed, and yet nothing had. Later in the afternoon, I noticed a faint smear on the bedsheet. A pale, off-white smudge. My cream, the one I apply every night before sleep. Thick and fragrant, designed to soften aging hands. I had used it, as always, before bed. And it was on the sheet. But not on my side. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at that small mark, like it was evidence in a courtroom. It shouldn't have been there. Not unless someone else had lain on that side. Not unless there had been contact, real, physical contact. I stood up, restless, pacing. My mind ran through possibilities, rationalizations, excuses. But none of them held. My husband hadn't come to bed. He had been in the guest room. He had said so himself, and I had seen him walking into it. His behavior hadn't changed. If anything, he seemed lighter, almost relieved. And then the other piece clicked into place, the camera. We had a small security system installed, mostly for peace of mind. One of the cameras faced the upstairs hallway, just outside our bedrooms. I wasn't obsessed with checking it, but I remembered, vaguely, that it logged motions and stored footage for a day or two. I opened the app on my phone, fingers trembling slightly. I scrolled through the night's timeline, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing. The entry for that hour was missing. Not corrupted. Not glitched. Just gone. Deleted. A chill ran down my spine. Only one other person had the login. My husband didn't even use the app. I had set it up months ago. The only other person who had asked for access, who had watched me enter the password, who had once helped me configure it, was the sun. I set the phone down as though it had burned me. In that moment, the truth wasn't just implied. It was screaming. Still, I didn't know what to do with it. The day dragged on. I moved through it like I was underwater. I made dinner, a bland risotto, too soft, too salty. My husband said it was good. I smiled weakly. The son didn't come to the table. He texted to say he'd eat later. I didn't respond. I couldn't bring myself to climb the stairs. Couldn't bear to walk past his closed door. That night, I lay in bed again, awake, listening. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the window, every shifting of the house made me flinch. But no one came. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear. I slept. In the morning, as I brushed my hair in front of the bathroom mirror, he appeared. The sun. He stood in the doorway, silent. He watched me, eyes unreadable. I froze, my hand mid-stroke. He spoke quietly, "You slept better last night." I didn't respond. He lingered for a second longer, then turned and walked away. The door remained open behind him. I stared at my reflection. My face looked pale. Drawn. Not older, exactly, but heavier. Like something had settled inside me that wouldn't be removed. I thought of telling someone. My sister, maybe. A friend. But what would I say? I wasn't even sure what had happened. Not exactly. Not legally. Not clearly. And what terrified me most wasn't the possibility that he had done something unforgivable. It was the growing awareness that I hadn't tried to stop it. That a part of me, lonely, quiet, buried, had accepted it. Maybe even wanted it. And that thought, more than anything, made me feel like a stranger in my own skin. I left the house that afternoon under the guise of needing groceries, though the pantry was full and the refrigerator humming with leftovers. I needed air. Space. Distance. As I drove, the silence in the car wrapped itself around me like a blanket that was both comforting and suffocating. The farther I got from the house, the lighter my chest felt, not free, exactly, but less constricted. I parked in a spot near the small lake where few people went during the week, pulled my coat tighter around me, and sat on a worn bench overlooking the still water. My hands trembled slightly as I rested them in my lap. There were no words for what I was feeling. Not exactly fear, though it lingered at the edges. Not guilt, though it twisted in my gut like a dull blade. It was more like dislocation. A kind of quiet dissociation from the version of myself I used to be. I watched a pair of ducks paddle lazily across the surface, their reflection rippling, distorting. I envied their simplicity. No memory. No implication. No aftermath. When I finally returned home, the sky had begun to dim. Dusk softened the sharp edges of the house as I pulled into the driveway. My husband was in the living room, reading. He looked up, offered a gentle smile, and asked if I had found everything I needed. I lied, as easily as breathing, and said yes. He patted the seat next to him, and I sat. He read a paragraph aloud from his book, something about Italian landscapes and crumbling ruins. I nodded along, not really listening. My thoughts were elsewhere. Upstairs. Behind a closed door. In a room that held a truth I couldn't face. Later that evening, I moved through my usual motions. I folded laundry. I prepared tea. I adjusted the pillows on the couch. Everything I did was measured, intentional, as if order could keep the chaos at bay. When I entered the bedroom, I paused at the threshold, then stepped inside slowly. I went to the closet and pulled out my nightgown. The soft cotton felt heavier than usual. I hesitated, then changed, folding my clothes with care. I didn't lock the door that night. I told myself it was because the lock had been sticking lately, because it made a noise that disturbed my sleep. But deep down, I knew the real reason. I wanted to believe I was still in control, that if I didn't lock it, it was because I chose not to, not because I was afraid. But I was afraid. Of what it meant if someone came. And what it meant if they didn't. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, eyes open, staring into the shadows above. Every sound, the wind against the window, the creak of the stairs, made my heart skip. But no one came. And yet, when I awoke, something was different. At first, I couldn't place it. The room looked the same. The light from the window fell in its usual diagonal stripe across the floor. But there was a shift in the air, a tension I could feel on my skin. I sat up slowly and noticed a folded piece of paper on my nightstand. No envelope. Just a single page. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, deliberate. The message was short. You knew it wasn't him. But you wanted it to be. That was all. No name. No signature. Just the words. I read them again. And again. My stomach turned. Because they were true. I dropped the paper into the drawer and shut it with a hard click. My hands were shaking, and I pressed them against the edge of the nightstand to steady them. My heart thudded loudly in my ears. Downstairs, the house felt quieter than usual. My husband had already gone out, a note left by the coffee pot saying he was at the hardware store and would be back in an hour. I poured myself a cup, barely tasting it as I sat at the table. The son entered the room just as I took my second sip. He didn't speak right away. Just moved to the cabinet and poured himself a glass of water. Then he turned to me, eyes steady. "Nice day," he said casually. I nodded. "It is." A beat passed. Then he added, "You got my note." It wasn't a question. I didn't respond. He didn't wait. He placed his glass in the sink and walked out. The air he left behind felt thick, dense with something I didn't want to name. I spent the rest of the morning trying to erase the feeling. I cleaned. I scrubbed the counters even though they were spotless. I organized drawers, refolded towels, rearranged spice jars. Anything to keep my hands moving. Anything to silence my thoughts. But they didn't stop. Because somewhere beneath the shame, beneath the confusion, beneath the guilt, something else stirred. Curiosity. I hated it. But I couldn't deny it. Later that day, I found myself in the hallway outside his room. The door was ajar. I hesitated, then knocked lightly. No answer. I pushed it open and peeked inside. The room was empty. I stepped in. His space was simple, a desk, a bed, a few scattered books. Nothing incriminating. Nothing personal. Just enough to suggest presence, but not enough to reveal anything real. Then I noticed the bottle. On the shelf near the window, next to a folded sweater. My husband's cologne. Except it wasn't. It was the same brand. The same shape. But newer. Fresher. I picked it up, turned it over. Purchased 2 weeks ago, according to the label. My breath caught. The implications rushed at me like cold water. It hadn't just been a moment. It hadn't just happened. It had been planned. Deliberate. And I had let it happen. Worse, I hadn't stopped it. I set the bottle down carefully, my hands now calm. There was no room left for pretending. Only choices. And I didn't know which one to make. That night, my husband announced that he would be going away for the weekend. A fishing trip with 2 of his old friends, he said. The same ones he had gone with last spring, though I couldn't recall him mentioning it until now. He was already packing when he told me, moving with the sort of quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. There was no invitation for me to join, and I didn't expect one. Still, a part of me hoped he might ask, might want me there. But he didn't. Instead, he handed me a grocery list, asking if I could restock a few essentials while he was away. I took the list, folded it, and tucked it into my pocket. When he left the next morning, I stood at the doorway, watching his car disappear down the road. The house, suddenly silent again, felt different this time. Not just empty, I exposed. Like a secret waiting to be uncovered. I moved through the day as if on autopilot. I watered the plants. I ran a load of laundry. I prepared a simple lunch and left most of it untouched. The hours passed slowly, the clock dragging its hands across the afternoon. Around 5 o'clock, I heard footsteps on the stairs. I knew who it was before he appeared. He entered the kitchen just as I was pouring a glass of water. Our eyes met, briefly, and then looked away. I thought you'd be out, he said, opening the fridge. I thought the same about you, I answered, almost automatically. He pulled out an apple and bit into it without another word. I turned to the sink, pretending to rinse something that wasn't there. My pulse beat against the back of my neck, loud and irregular. He didn't stay long. After a few minutes, he retreated upstairs, and I remained frozen by the sink, the glass still in my hand. Later that evening, I found myself in the attic. I told myself I was looking for an old box of scarves, something to pass the time, but the truth was more complicated. The attic was dusty, filled with forgotten things. My husband's childhood toys, faded photographs, boxes of documents. And among them, I found something unexpected, a small notebook, tucked inside a box labeled miscellaneous. It wasn't a diary, not exactly. Just pages filled with quotes, observations, fragments. Some were philosophical, some poetic. But what struck me most was the handwriting. It was his, the son's. One line stood out, sometimes the lie is easier than the silence. I closed the notebook and set it back in the box. When I came back downstairs, the house was quiet. The lamps cast long shadows across the floor. I moved to the living room, sat on the edge of the couch, and listened. And then, footsteps. Not hurried. Not tentative. Just steady. He appeared in the doorway. This time, he didn't speak. I stood slowly. My hands trembled slightly, but I didn't hide them. We kissed. There was no explanation. No hesitation. Just the weight of unspoken understanding hanging between us. Afterward, I walked to the bathroom and closed the door behind me. I turned on the light, looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection didn't flinch. There was no satisfaction in what had happened. No thrill. Only quiet resignation. I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on my face. Back in the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. The silence in the house had shifted again, heavier now, charged. I listened for sounds, for movement, but none came. The rest of the night passed slowly. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind replayed every detail. The way he looked at me. The absence of resistance. The fact that it had all felt inevitable. I didn't know what that said about me. Or about him. In the morning, I awoke to find the door slightly open. The hallway was quiet. I got up, wrapped myself in a robe, and made my way downstairs. On the kitchen table was a cup of tea, still steaming. My usual blend. My usual mug. I picked it up carefully, holding it with both hands. There was no note. No sign of him. Just the tea. Just the silence. Just me. And the growing weight of a decision I didn't yet know how to make. The days that followed were quiet, unnervingly so. My husband returned from his trip as if nothing had shifted in his absence, as though the house had remained in its same safe, predictable rhythm. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and an apologetic smile for bringing back the wrong brand of coffee. I nodded, thanked him, pretended to care about the small mistake. My responses were automatic, rehearsed. I had become skilled at that, at performing normalcy. He unpacked in silence, humming faintly as he folded shirts and restocked the bathroom shelf with his shaving kit. I watched him from the hallway, taking in every motion with a detached fascination. His world was so tidy, so unknowing. I wondered what he'd say, what he'd do, if I told him the truth. If I confessed that while he stood in a river holding a fishing rod, I stood in this house with the weight of something irreversible in my chest. But I said nothing. I said nothing because silence had become my only shield. At breakfast the next morning, I watched the steam rise from our mugs. He talked about a new project at work. Something about deadlines, logistics, his usual language. I tried to follow, but my mind drifted. Not toward guilt this time, not exactly. It had begun shifting into something else, exhaustion, maybe. Or numbness. A kind of dull, persistent ache that replaced the sharp sting of consequence. The son joined us midway through the meal. He was quieter than usual, his eyes down, his posture withdrawn. There was no smugness now, no implied questions. Just restraint. I wondered if he felt it too, that line we'd crossed had split something in both of us. A stillness. An uncertainty. We didn't speak to each other that day. Or the day after. But the silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate, thick, heavy with everything unsaid. On the third morning, a small note appeared on the kitchen counter. Folded once, placed next to the sugar bowl. My name was scrawled across the top, not in my husband's careful, slanted script, but in a shorter, bolder hand. I opened it slowly. I'm leaving for a while. Needed distance. This house feels too close. There was no name. But I didn't need one. He left later that afternoon. I watched through the upstairs window as he loaded a single bag into the back of his car, started the engine, and pulled away without looking back. There was no goodbye. Just the fading sound of tires on gravel, the brief shift in wind as his car vanished past the trees. The house felt different without him. Too quiet, yes, but in a strangely calming way. The air felt less dense. The walls didn't echo quite as loudly. I walked room to room that evening, straightening things, wiping dust from the surfaces, as though preparing the house to be lived in again, not haunted. In the guest room, I found his cologne bottle missing. That discovery stilled me. A small, definitive detail, but one that held an outsized weight. He had taken it with him. Maybe that was the only thing he'd taken. Maybe that was enough. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered into the living room and sat on the couch in the dark. The moonlight spilled across the rug in soft, shifting patterns, and the hum of the refrigerator in the next room became a kind of rhythm to breathe against. I tried to remember what my life had felt like before all of this. Before the house, before the marriage, before the silence that now defined my days. I tried to picture myself before I had begun measuring time in glances and absences. But the image was blurry, like an old photograph faded at the edges. The next morning, I found myself writing. Not a journal, not exactly. More like fragments, sentences that had lived in my head for too long and needed to land somewhere. I filled the first page with a single thought. I no longer know who I was supposed to become. It startled me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. The days moved on. My husband noticed the change in me. Not immediately, but gradually. He asked if I was sleeping well. I said yes. He offered to take me out to dinner. I said no. He paused one night, looking at me across the table, and asked if I was happy. I smiled and told him I was just tired. I wasn't lying. Not really. I was tired in ways I couldn't describe, in places I hadn't known existed inside me. One afternoon, while sorting the laundry, I came across a towel that wasn't ours. It was a dark blue, slightly coarser, not one of the matching set we kept in the master bath. I held it for a moment, puzzled, and then realized it was one of the son's. Forgotten in the back room, maybe. Or left behind deliberately. I folded it and set it aside, not knowing why I felt the need to keep it. A week passed without word. Then another. My husband settled back into his routines. He mentioned a conference out of town and asked if I wanted to come. I declined. He left for 2 nights, and for the first time in weeks, I felt peace. No eyes watching. No glances to interpret. Just me and the quiet. I found myself humming as I watered the plants, dusted the shelves, swept the corners of the porch. And then, the day he returned, I found another note. This time, it was slipped beneath the doormat. Just 2 words. Thank you. I stood there, barefoot, the paper crinkling slightly in my hands. No explanation. No follow-up. Just those words. And I understood. Not gratitude in the simple sense. But something deeper. Acknowledgement. Closure, maybe. Or an apology too complex to say aloud. I didn't cry. I folded the note and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Not to keep. Just to remember. The note stayed in the drawer for days before I finally took it out again. I hadn't forgotten about it, on the contrary, I thought about it often, especially in the quiet hours of the morning when the house had not yet woken. Thank you. 2 words, weightless in appearance but heavy in meaning. I had run them over in my head 100 different ways. Thank you for what? For silence? For complicity? For not saying no? Or perhaps for saying nothing at all? I didn't want to define it. Not anymore. The more I tried to explain it to myself, the more distant the truth felt. It had become a knot that wouldn't untangle, and I no longer had the strength or desire to pull at the ends. I didn't feel guilt the way I used to. It had dulled into something else, something harder to name, like dust settling over sharp edges, making everything quiet and unclear. My husband noticed a shift in me, but he couldn't place it. He'd begun asking more questions, though never the right ones. "Are you okay? You seem distracted. Is something on your mind?" All soft, safe prompts I could easily dismiss with a smile and a gentle shake of the head. He didn't press. He never had. In truth, the distance between us had always been there, I'd just become more aware of it. Before, I had filled the space with hope. Hope that time would soften him, that his silences meant thoughtfulness rather than disinterest. But now, I knew better. His quiet had nothing behind it. No mystery, no hidden warmth. Just absence. He left for work one Thursday morning, as he always did, briefcase in one hand, keys in the other. I watched from the window as he backed out of the driveway, glanced once in the mirror, and disappeared down the road. I waited a few minutes, then turned back toward the house. It felt cold. Not the kind of cold that begged for a sweater, but the kind that started somewhere deeper, somewhere internal. I moved about slowly, straightening the kitchen, wiping down counters that were already clean. I opened drawers just to close them again. I felt like I was rehearsing my own routine, a play I had already performed too many times. Later that day, I went into the garage to find a box of winter blankets. I hadn't been in there for weeks, and the air smelled of old wood and forgotten seasons. As I moved a few stacked bins aside, I found an old trunk that hadn't been touched in years, one of the few things my husband had brought with him from his previous life and never opened since. I knew I shouldn't. But I also knew I would. The latch creaked as I opened it. Inside were faded sweaters, old photo frames, a few cracked CDs. And at the bottom, tucked in a fabric pouch, was a small, square envelope. No name, no date. I held it in my hands for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single photo, a much younger version of my husband, his arm around a woman I didn't recognize. She had dark hair, a striking smile, and a warmth I hadn't seen in any of the framed pictures still hanging in the house. I turned the photo over. On the back, in small, neat handwriting, were the words, "For everything you were, and everything I couldn't be." I stared at it until my eyes burned. Then I put it back, closed the envelope, and returned everything to the trunk just as I had found it. I didn't ask him about it when he came home that night. What would I have said? I had my secrets too now. Maybe that was what marriage became in time, not a merging of lives, but a mutual agreement to leave certain doors closed. The next evening, I found myself walking to the edge of the property, where the woods began. The sun was low, the air just cold enough to numb the tips of my fingers. I stood for a long time in silence, staring into the trees, until the wind shifted and I turned back. He was standing by the porch. Not my husband. The other one. He looked different. Paler, thinner maybe. Or perhaps it was just the light. He didn't speak. Neither did I. We stared at each other for a long time, the space between us filled with everything that had been and everything that could never be undone. Eventually, he stepped forward. Just one step. Then another. I didn't move. We spent the night together. In the morning, I woke before the sun. The house was still. The bed beside me was empty. He had already gone. No note this time. No cup of tea. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the shame to return. But it didn't come. Not like before. It had lost its sting. Instead, I felt something else. Stillness. Not peace, not yet, but a kind of clarity. A space inside me that had been too full for too long had finally emptied. When my husband came home from work later that day, I asked him how his day had gone. He answered, as he always did, with a short description of meetings and emails and traffic. I nodded along, smiling in the right places, offering sympathy at the right turns. I watched him as he spoke. Not with malice. Not with resentment. Just observation. He hadn't changed. But I had. And I didn't yet know what that would mean. I began avoiding mirrors again. Not out of guilt, and not out of fear, but because I could no longer recognize the version of myself looking back. There was something in my expression now that felt foreign, like a shift in posture I hadn't meant to make, or a permanent crease carved across the middle of my life. It wasn't that I looked older. I simply looked different. As though the outline of who I'd been had softened at the edges, making room for someone else. The silence between my husband and me grew longer, though neither of us acknowledged it. He asked fewer questions, and I answered them with less care. He stopped touching my arm when he passed behind me in the kitchen. I stopped pausing to wait for him at the door when we walked together. There was no fight, no rupture. Just a gentle, gradual disconnection, like a thread unraveling between us one quiet loop at a time. He brought home a small bouquet of flowers one evening, completely unprompted. They were wrapped in thin paper, the kind you buy from the supermarket near the exit. Purple chrysanthemums. I thanked him, placing them in a narrow vase and setting them on the dining room table. He watched me do it with a hopeful look that disappeared the moment I turned away. We had dinner in silence that night. I tried to find words that would make him feel close to me again, words that would explain anything at all. But my tongue felt too heavy. I didn't know how to begin a conversation when I no longer knew who I was speaking as. Later, I went to the bedroom and sat in the armchair by the window. The house was still. Even the floorboards, which normally creaked and shifted with the cold, remained quiet. I held a book in my hands but never turned a page. I listened to the ticking of the wall clock, each second a quiet reminder of time passing, of choices made. I thought of him, not my husband, but the other one. The son who had come and gone like a gust of wind, leaving everything in disorder. I hadn't seen him since that night. No texts, no emails, no word at all. It wasn't just absence. It was erasure. And yet, his presence still lingered. Not physically, he had taken everything with him. But the effect remained, like the ring a cup leaves on a wooden table. You can wipe at it. You can polish it. But the shape stays. The next morning, my husband made breakfast for both of us. Scrambled eggs, buttered toast, a bowl of cut fruit. He had arranged everything neatly on 2 plates, as if this gesture might stitch something back together. I thanked him, sat across from him, and tried to eat. The food tasted fine. But it might as well have been paper. He asked if I'd like to take a short trip somewhere. Just a weekend away, he said. Maybe the coast. We could use the time. I looked at him, unsure whether to agree out of politeness or decline out of honesty. I didn't want to travel with him. Not because I disliked him, but because I didn't want to pretend. I didn't want to spend hours in a car sharing small talk or sleep beside him in a bed that now felt like borrowed space. I told him I'd think about it. That evening, I went into the garden to trim the withered stems from the rose bushes. It was a task I used to enjoy, the quiet ritual of care, the delicate balance between pruning and preserving. But even the garden felt foreign now. Each snip of the shears echoed like a decision I hadn't wanted to make. I found a letter in the mailbox that day. It was addressed to both of us, from a cousin inviting us to an anniversary dinner next month. I opened it in the kitchen and read it aloud. My husband smiled and said it might be nice to go. I nodded again, giving the performance of agreement without any intention of following through. That night, after he had gone to bed, I walked into the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress creaked softly beneath me. It was the bed he used to sleep in, and the one I now associated with the beginning of the unraveling. The room smelled faintly of dust and old books. The closet door was open a crack, revealing a few forgotten jackets and a single pair of worn shoes. I reached into the nightstand and pulled out a photograph I'd tucked there weeks ago. It was one I had taken accidentally, a test shot from my phone when I meant to clean the lens. It showed part of the hallway, a sliver of the mirror, and a blurred silhouette in the background. I kept it not because it held a secret, but because it captured a moment I hadn't meant to preserve. Something unposed. Something real. I tore it in half slowly, then again, and dropped the pieces into the small trash bin beside the dresser. The next morning, I received a text. Unknown number. Just a few words. I hope you're okay. No name. No return message. But I knew. I didn't respond. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and went to sit on the porch. The sky was soft with early light, and the trees were motionless. The silence no longer felt heavy. Just empty. And somehow, I preferred that. When my husband stepped outside a few minutes later, I didn't turn to greet him. He stood beside me for a while, hands in his pockets, looking out at the garden I no longer wanted to tend. I miss how we used to talk, he said, almost to himself. I nodded. Not because I agreed. But because it felt kinder than saying nothing. He left for work shortly after. I remained on the porch, holding the mug between both hands, watching the steam rise and disappear into the cold air. I didn't know what came next. But I knew I couldn't go back. The morning I decided to leave began like every other, slow, muted, and quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. I sat at the edge of the bed for a long time before dressing. The air in the room felt thick, not with tension, but with stagnation. I opened the window to let in a breeze, but all I got was the dry scent of a cooling spring, tinged with pollen and distant road dust. Downstairs, the house creaked the same way it always did when I walked across the hallway, but that day, every sound seemed louder. More final. I poured myself a cup of coffee and didn't add cream. I took it black, the way I used to before I met him. I let the bitterness settle on my tongue as I stood in the doorway of the living room, staring at the space we used to sit together, and realizing how long it had been since we actually sat there as a couple. I didn't rush. I moved through the house with deliberation, touching corners and edges, running my hands across wood and fabric and ceramic, not to say goodbye, exactly, but to register that these things, this place, had existed around me. That I hadn't imagined the years I'd spent trying to fit inside a space that had been built for someone else. I didn't pack much. A small bag, just the essentials. I took a change of clothes, a pair of shoes, a few toiletries. I left behind all the dresses he had ever complimented and kept only the plain ones. I didn't take my wedding ring, not out of defiance, but because I no longer felt it belonged to my hand. I placed it on the vanity, next to a small hairbrush I hadn't used in weeks. When my husband returned from the store that afternoon, I was already sitting on the porch. My bag rested at my feet. He hesitated when he saw me there, his eyes moving from the luggage to my face. He didn't ask right away. Instead, he greeted me with the same quiet civility that had once felt comforting and now felt like distance disguised as kindness. I told him I needed time. Space. Clarity. I didn't say the words he might have expected, not "I'm leaving you," not "I can't do this anymore." Just, "I need to remember who I am." He nodded slowly. Whether he understood or not, I couldn't tell. But he didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply said, "Okay." The way someone agrees to let go of something they were never truly holding. I left without looking back. The drive was quiet. No music. Just the hum of tires and the rush of wind through barely opened windows. I didn't know where I was going when I turned onto the main road. I just needed to move. To escape the gravity of that house, those rooms, that version of myself that had grown too quiet, too pliable, too unsure. Eventually, I stopped at a small lake a few hours from home, the same one I had visited alone once before. I checked into a modest inn nearby and carried my bag up the creaking staircase to a room with peeling wallpaper and a view of the water. It wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but it was honest. Unpolished. And that felt like enough. I spent the first 2 days in near silence. I walked the trails by the lake. I sat on the porch of the inn and watched the water ripple in the breeze. I wrote in a notebook, not long entries, just phrases, fragments of thought, pieces of memory that surfaced without warning. I made simple meals for myself, ate them slowly, cleaned up without hurry. There was a stillness to everything, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't scare me. The absence of him, the sun, became something I felt less and less with each passing hour. He had been a disruption, a shift in the quiet, and now that he was gone, the space he had filled returned to its original emptiness. It wasn't loss. It was release. I thought about sending a message to my husband, not to explain, but to reassure him that I was safe. That I hadn't vanished. But I didn't. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I knew that part of what had kept us trapped for so long was the way we always tried to smooth over discomfort with reassurance. This time, I needed to let the silence say what I couldn't. On the third morning, I woke before dawn and stood by the window, watching the mist rise off the lake. I held a cup of lukewarm tea in my hands and felt something stir inside me, not clarity, not certainty, but breath. Something that reminded me I was alive, and that being alive didn't mean being anchored to someone else's expectations. In the afternoon, I walked into town, bought a simple canvas bag from a small local store, and filled it with fruit, a notebook, and a pen. I sat under a tree near the lake and began writing not about what had happened, but about what I still wanted. The list surprised me. It wasn't grand. It wasn't even bold. It was made of small things, walking at dusk, reading without interruption, planting something and watching it grow. I cried a little as I wrote. Not from sadness, but from recognition. I hadn't thought about my own wants in such a long time that seeing them in ink made them feel like truths that had always been waiting for permission. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I received a message from my husband. It was brief. I understand. Take your time. There was no bitterness in his words. Just acceptance. Or perhaps surrender. I didn't respond. Not yet. But I held the phone in my lap for a long time, letting the message settle into me like rain into soil. The next morning, I went back to the lake. I stepped into the water slowly, letting the cold climb up my legs, then my waist, until I was submerged to my chest. I tilted my head back, closed my eyes, and breathed in the damp, clean air. For a moment, I imagined the weight of everything washing off me. The guilt, the confusion, the longing, the disappointment, all dissolving into the water, carried away by ripples I couldn't follow. When I stepped out, the world felt quiet again. But this time, the quiet wasn't empty. It was mine. The first thing I noticed when I returned home was how small the house looked. Not in size, not physically, but in presence. It stood there as it always had, unchanged and waiting, but it no longer carried the same weight in my mind. The towering emotional walls I'd built around it, around the life I'd lived inside, had eroded during my time away. I saw the place for what it was now, a quiet, tired structure full of unspoken things. Not haunted, not cruel, just worn. The garden was overgrown. Weeds curled along the edges of the flower beds. The hydrangeas had browned at their tips. I ran my fingers across the brittle leaves as I passed, part of me wondering if they'd missed me, if their fading color mirrored my absence. I reached the front door, hesitated, then stepped inside. The scent was the same, the faint mustiness of old wood, the lingering perfume of furniture polish, the distant memory of a man's cologne that I used to associate with comfort. I stood in the hallway, bag still slung over my shoulder, and listened. The quiet greeted me like a familiar acquaintance, neither warm nor cold. He was in the kitchen. I heard the clink of a glass being set on the counter, the shuffle of footsteps. When I entered, he looked up, startled but not surprised. His eyes didn't widen. His shoulders didn't tense. It was as if he had already rehearsed this moment. "You're back," he said, voice low and even. "I am." A beat passed. He motioned toward the table. I sat. He did the same. No questions. No demands. Just a long pause between two people who had grown used to spaces between words. "I didn't know if you would come back," he said finally. "I didn't either," I replied. Another pause. But this one felt less heavy. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, not of him, not of me. Just a picture I'd taken near the lake. The water. The trees. A pale sky. I handed it to him without explanation. He turned it over, saw the date scribbled in the corner, and gave a faint nod. "I thought you might want to see where I've been," I said. He looked at the image a moment longer, then set it on the table between us. "I'm glad you're okay," he said. "I'm not sure I am," I answered. "But I'm better than I was." That was the only truth I could offer him. The rest of the afternoon passed in near silence. I unpacked slowly, moving through each room with care. Nothing had been moved. My closet was untouched. My books still rested on the nightstand. A thin layer of dust had settled over the dresser, but otherwise, the space was exactly as I'd left it. I changed the sheets before going to bed. Not because they were dirty, but because I couldn't sleep under the same fabric. I needed something clean, something new, even if only symbolic. That night, I dreamed of mirrors. In each one, I saw a different version of myself, younger, older, happier, lonelier. None of them looked back. The next morning, I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. The same one I'd taken to the lake. I flipped through pages of scattered thoughts and half-finished sentences. Some entries felt foreign now, written by a woman I no longer was. Eventually, he joined me. We sat side by side, sipping in silence. "There's something I want to ask you," he said quietly. I waited. "Do you want to stay?" The question landed gently, but it pulsed through me like a heartbeat. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a trap. It was an offering. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window, watched a bird land on the fence post and flutter away again. The sky was clear. "I want to be somewhere honest," I said finally. "And I don't know if that's here." He nodded. "Fair." We didn't speak for the rest of the morning. I spent the day sorting. Not just objects, but memories. I opened old drawers and found receipts, birthday cards, photographs, ticket stubs. I paused over a postcard from a trip we never took. It had been a gift from someone else, a reminder of a promise we hadn't kept. I placed it in a small pile marked gone. In the late afternoon, I found myself standing in the guest room. The room where the other he, had once slept. The air was still. The bed was made. But there was something missing I hadn't noticed before, the scent. It was gone. No cologne. No trace. I opened the window, let in the breeze, and for the first time, the air felt clean. Unmarked. I stood there a long while, letting the wind pass over my skin. That night, I wrote again. This time, I wrote not about endings, but about beginnings. I didn't know if they were mine. I didn't know what shape they would take. But I knew I was capable of choosing them, and that knowledge felt more powerful than anything I had experienced in months. I slept deeply. And in the morning, I woke with clarity. Not about where I would go. Not about what I would do. But about what I wouldn't carry anymore. I went to the backyard just after sunrise. The sky was painted with faint streaks of pink. The air was crisp. I stood barefoot on the grass, letting the earth remind me of something I had forgotten, that everything moves forward, whether we're ready or not. Inside, I made a cup of tea. No sugar. No lemon. Just the plain bitterness of leaves steeped in silence. Before the day fully began, I sat at the kitchen table, pulled a sheet of paper from my notebook, and began to write a letter. Not to him. Not to the other him. But to myself. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't lie.